Hey, Keegan, can you share your screen? It says it's disabled. Okay. Okay, I'm getting this. Very good. So welcome back. We're kind of up to our last presentation of the day of the conference. And I'd like to welcome our next speaker from the West Coast. And that is Miss Ingrid Emmons. She's joining us remotely, and she is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Aveanna Healthcare. She is a DEI leader and employee engagement strategist with deep people experience and proven ability to deliver strategically across several industries, including healthcare, hospitality, financial services, and telecom. She's currently enrolled in a clinical psychology program at Pepperdine. Her goal is to better understand the science behind happiness and bias, and to integrate that into her life, both personally and professionally. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and has traveled extensively, especially in the Caribbean. Her inspiration, she says, and motivation and fulfillment are fueled by her 3 multi-hyphenate children and her grand-doggy. She's going to focus a good deal of her presentation on cultural humility, and I would like to welcome Ms. Emmons and thank her for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining today. So we are going to dive into the topic of cultural humility in healthcare. So why don't we go ahead and get started? If you would move to the second slide.
Are you not able to control that, Ingrid? I can do it for you.
I'm not able to control that remotely. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So rules of the road, I like to establish these. So what you learn here leaves here. You know, we always say what you do in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, it's the complete opposite as we have the conversation today. And I would encourage you to stay curious. I think it's so important because what you're going to see as we have this conversation around cultural humility is it's constantly changing. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to assume good intentions as we navigate the discussion today. So these are your 3 rules of the road. All right, next slide, please. So what is cultural humility? Right? At the end of the day, it's about being open to individuals and different cultures, their communities, and their experiences. And I'm going to ask you a question. As we think about cultural humility, what is the difference from your standpoint between the concept of belief and the concept of knowledge? And I want you to sit and think about that for just a moment, right? And then I'm going to share with you what the difference is. What is the difference between belief and knowledge? Belief is when we process information based on our own experiences. You have had some phenomenal speakers. I've joined the other sessions today, and there's been a focus on spirituality and religion, right? A focus on ageism. There's so many aspects, right, that mean different things to us based on our own life experiences. And the conversation that I'm having with you today is about focusing on knowledge rather than belief, which means that you are open to new experiences. And I'm going to give you an example. Not too long ago, I had a conversation with someone and they said, you know what? I'm Hispanic, but I don't speak Spanish. And sometimes that's embarrassing for me. And I had to stop and think about that for just a moment. The reality is that when you process from a place of belief, our brains, right, are trying to be efficient. So they streamline information and they attach concepts. So in my mind, if you were Hispanic, you spoke Spanish. But when I shifted from a place of belief to knowledge, it meant I could separate those concepts. And that is what the conversation is today about achieving cultural humility, is separating concepts, ideologies that we would typically connect. So let's continue having that discussion. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, culture, we can break that down into our behaviors and our attitudes. Our behaviors include our norms, our roles, what are our customs and traditions, what are our habits, which could be very different to our customs and traditions. And then finally, what are our practices? And our attitudes include our beliefs. They could be political, they could be moral, as you heard earlier, right? They could have to do with our values. What I value may not be what you value, may not be what your patient values, what your patient's family values, right? What do we know? We spoke about belief versus knowledge, right? So what information are we operating with? What are our opinions? Perhaps we have superstitions. And finally, maybe stereotypes. Maybe we're painting a broad brush across a group. And I'll tell you, right, as I stand here before you as a woman who is an immigrant with 3 children, you could have other people listening to the conversation today or in the audience, right? And demographically, we seem the same, but we could have had completely different experiences. And as you look at the squares on the screen, and as you look at the people sitting beside you, I want you to say something out loud. There are no 2 people sitting in this audience or on this call who are exactly the same, because we are nuanced, layered, complex beings, and so are your patients, and so are your patients' families. So what we're going to talk about today as we achieve cultural humility is I'm going to give you a framework that I would like you to use that you can then apply going forward, recognizing that every time you have a conversation with a patient and every time you have a conversation with a patient's family, they are like no other. They are nuanced, complex human beings. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, we're going to go through an exercise, right? We spoke earlier about belief versus knowledge. A lot of our beliefs come from connecting associations with assumptions. All right, so let's go through this exercise together. And again, I'm going to ask you to stay curious and assume good intentions as we do this, right? Because it will require open hearts and minds. All right, next slide, please. So as we take a look at this, we're obviously not going to ask you to share your reactions out loud. We're going to show you some images, and then I'm going to ask you to write down, if you do have access to pen and paper, the first word that comes to mind when you see these images. Don't overthink it. Now, the question becomes, do you have different feelings about some of these images? In what ways do any of these represent part of your culture or your beliefs? Are there any of these images that make you uncomfortable? All right, so we're going to ask you to write down the first word that you think of when you see these images, and we'll show them to you one at a time. All right, perfect. So we'll take a look at these that came up all at once, which is just fine. But as you take a look at these, right, just stop for a moment and take a look at each of these. And I want you to ask yourself genuinely, do some introspection. What is the one word that comes to mind? What is your immediate reaction to some of these images? Stop for a moment and do that for me. All right, thank you for having an open heart and mind as you go through this exercise. I promise you one thing, there's no one person on this call or no one person in that room who has had the exact same reaction to all of these images that you did. And it is the exact same scenario that you face when you have a conversation with a patient and a patient's family, right? Our life experiences and exposure have caused us to form different opinions and reactions to these images. And that is the conversation today. How do we navigate this effectively? Because the one thing we do know is that we don't know. We cannot project how someone is going to react based on painting a broad brush, based on making assumptions. All right, next slide, please. So there is a spectrum of cultural humility, right? And again, I'd like you to do some introspection and ask yourself, where do I fall on this spectrum? Am I culturally knowledgeable? Right? Which means that there is this level of acceptance of inclusion. I understand that this is something I need to be knowledgeable about. I may not necessarily be there, but I recognize that there is a need. Then there's cultural awareness, right? Where you're culturally safe, you're respectful, you are really curious. And so you're starting to build on the knowledge that you have, shifting from a place of belief to knowledge. And then the ultimate place where we want to be is cultural competence, where we have this ability to effectively problem solve, right? Recognizing that there are various perspectives. Now, we're always starting over. This is a dynamic spectrum, right? Because I could fully understand a patient and their family, and then I'm on to the next one, and I need to start this process over again. But I am invested in doing so because I recognize the importance of cultural humility. All right, so let's move to the next slide as we think about that spectrum and we keep it in mind. I love this image of a kaleidoscope. And the reason why we have this image here is because, again, it's dynamic, right? Remember what I mentioned earlier, there's nobody sitting on either side of you in that room, and nobody who's on the call today who is exactly the same. Yet we have this tendency of fitting ourselves and others into neatly labeled boxes that would fit with our perception of what constitutes identity, ethnicity. Maybe it's even about our favorite sports team. I know I've been part of conversation sometimes, you know, I'm on a Zoom call and the conversation was all about, okay, well, how did the Braves do? Right? I have no clue. I'm not a sports person. So it's the small nuanced things where we don't recognize that we're actually being exclusive, not inclusive, in terms of the nature of the discussions that we're having. And the problem, but the opportunity, is that humans are kaleidoscopic. We don't fit into any one box, right? Which is why cultural humility is so important. So let's continue the conversation with that lens. Next slide, please. So the reality, what is the reality? We all know. We are fractured. We are fractured, folks. We are broken into two distinct groups. We have our health ecosystem trusters, those who trust the system, those who trust the medical professionals. And we have our health ecosystem distrusters. And we have our distrusters for so many reasons. And what we're not here to do today is to argue whether people should trust or distrust the system, because again, it's about their own experiences. What we know is that people's experience with the healthcare system is very different. In fact, for rural high minority areas, We know that distances to intensive care and cardiac care facilities are typically over 30 miles. So what does that mean in terms of their ability to access care? So we are dealing with the reality of we have people who are trust us and distrust us, sometimes even in the same families. You are having conversations with them about the what's next. And they are operating from a place of distrust in many instances. So what do we do? How do we achieve cultural humility? Let's go to the next slide, please. So trend number one, the dispersion of authority. So while medical professionals and other authorities and health experts are seen as trusted health information sources, guess what? Everybody is an expert these days. They go on social media, they consult with their friends who are also experts from their standpoint. Their families have surged in influence. Many people have spent over 12 months in the same location due to COVID with family members. So what happens is they become your trusted advisor. We know so many people who did not get care during COVID, routine care, and we're seeing that show up now in the system. Who do you think that they've grown to trust during this interim period? The people that they saw every day, their internet searches, whether they're valid or not. That is the reality, right? So as we talk about who the decision maker is when we're trying to create this environment of cultural humility, we have to first understand who the person who is of authority that they will trust is, right? So let's talk about how we do that effectively. Next slide, please. Trend number two, diversity in our society. The US is rapidly moving towards becoming a more ethnically and culturally diverse country. So the reality is, I don't care where you work in this country, you are going to need to understand how to develop this skill set of cultural humility. In fact, whites are expected to account for less than 50% of the population by 2040. Right? And there is this movement toward what we call the minority majority population, which is why one of the trends is we no longer refer to groups as a minority group, because in actual counts, they're not. So it's no longer a relevant term. And in 4 states right now, as we speak, right, we have the minority population representing the majority. It is unavoidable in our professions. Cultural humility is like any other skill set, and it's important to know how to navigate the system. All right, let's move to the next slide. Trend number 3, disparity in care. Health disparities in quality of care and access to care have led to disparities in the treatment and management, especially during end-of-life care. I don't have to tell you some of these statistics. Even pre-COVID-19, we know that people of color are experiencing 2.4 times the infant mortality rate relative to other groups, right? Pregnancy-related deaths, prevalence and severity of chronic conditions and mental health risks, leading to what? Distrust, leading to distrust. And what we're trying to do as we go through this exercise together is to gain the trust of these populations. It's so key. So let's talk about this framework and how to do so. If we go to the next slide, given the trends that we have covered. So I want us to talk through what I'm referring to as the CARE framework. The C stands for curiosity, right? I'm interested in understanding your perspective. That's what the C stands for. A is awareness. Because I now understand your perspective and I'm developing this relationship of trust, I'm going to use all the information that you have shared, all the information that I have observed, And then I'm going to do my own research so that I can become more aware. And then the conversations that I'm going to have with you going forward are going to come from a place of R for respect. And then finally, we are on the same page. Your feelings are valid. We want the same things, right? Whether it's a patient or the patient's family, which is to provide the optimal care, to share all the accurate information. And that's coming from a place of empathy. The difference between compassion and empathy is the verb. It's when you activate, right? That is the difference. Compassion is, I care about you. Empathy, as I'm doing something about it. I'm putting it into motion. So this is a care framework that we want to apply in this instance. All right, next slide. Let's go through an example together. So here is a situation. And in this situation, the female patient relies on the male spouse to make all the relevant decisions. And there are many different cultures, right, where this is the standard operating procedure. And the male spouse has to be the liaison, right, in the conversation. But the challenge that we are faced with is that the female patient ultimately needs to agree to the course of treatment. So for example, some Somalis, right, believe that healthcare decisions involve the whole family, with a male family member being the spokesperson for the family and the father being the bearer of bad news to the patient, right? And that's just one example. There are many other cultures and households where this is the case. So let's apply this care framework together. Curiosity. Take the time to explain in a generous and gentle way why the patient has to specifically consent to their own treatment, right? And understand if this is end-of-life care, what is to be expected. Here is a response from the male spouse. In our household, this is just not the way we handle important decisions. Let's move to A for awareness. So here is the question of the caregiver. Can you share your concerns with the patient making this decision? Right, so you are open to getting this feedback because you want to develop this relationship. Response. The patient does not know enough about her medical history to make any sound decisions. Respect. What is the pertinent information you believe the patient to be missing, and can we share that information with her? So the spouse is coming around. Okay, the patient has a history of drug allergies, and yes, we can take the time to do so. And then finally, applying empathy. Here's the caregiver. I understand your concerns about ensuring your spouse makes informed decisions, and the more information she has about her health, is the more likely she'll be able to access the best care possible. We want the same thing. I'm only going to say that 10 more times today, right? We want the same thing. That is the message that you're trying to convey as we apply this care framework. All right, next slide. Awesome. So what can we do, right? Recognition of unique influences is so important. And I'm going to say this again, right? Remember that slide, remember that image of us as a kaleidoscope. And remember, there are no two people in this meeting today who are exactly the same, right? And as a healthcare provider, we must have a clear understanding and recognition of the unique and specific influences culture has on a patient's behaviors, attitudes, preferences, and decisions generally, and especially around end-of-life care. I joined a family the other day and they wanted time alone with their pastor, right? The bottom line is this was an important extension of this family member, right? I've been in households where they pray 5 times a day. This was important to incorporate. But we can't know everything about every household, because just because you're Muslim, just because you're Jamaican, just because you are Anglo-Saxon, it doesn't matter. We all have these nuanced differences. And so applying the care framework allows you to be curious, observe what's going on, use that information to become more aware, respectfully apply what you know, and then ensure they know that you are aligned. You want the same things. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Fostering trust. Remember what we said earlier? Our system is broken because of the healthcare inequities. And the more people have used the system, in many cases, is the more they distrust the system, unfortunately. So we are doing the job of fostering trust, right, to rebuild that connection with the patient and family during what could be the most difficult time of their lives. We know end-of-life care means more than treating physical symptoms. It extends to the psychosocial, existential, and spiritual aspects of the patient's needs. It's so much more, right, than anything that's physical. So understanding where they go for strength, understanding who the decision makers are is so important. And you do that by what? Applying your care framework. All right, next slide, please. Education. Here are some key questions that help you satisfy this need to be curious, aware, respectful, and empathetic, right? What is the patient and family's perspective on death and dying? What is the patient and family's perspective on health and suffering? In some cultures, they believe that if you are suffering, it's because you are deserving of suffering because of decisions that you have made. Others believe it's a way for you to build strength and resilience, and it's a test. What is the patient and family's perspective on hospice and palliative care services? Many people want to stay home in their homes and will not accept any other course of action. What is the patient and family's acceptance of Western healthcare practices? Or do they believe only in alternative traditional practices? In that case, our job is to explain, if you're using alternative traditional practices, is there a different impact on their care? We have to be knowledgeable. What is the role of spiritual and religious beliefs and practices? In some instances, there's a view actually that if you articulate that you're going to die, what happens is it speeds it up in some cultures. The role of the family, who is considered part of the family? In some communities, you have a chosen family, especially in the LGBTQ community, where people no longer have relationships with their blood relatives in some instances. So they have redefined their families. How do the patient and family communicate? Is there a need for interpreter services? What is the education level of the family? I had someone, a nurse, who was actually on my team, and her mother was dying, and she was taking time off work, even though her father had been in the hospital for weeks. And it was because her father just was not educated, and English was not his first language, and he really struggled with understanding what the medical professionals were telling him about her mother. And she recognized that the medical professionals in some instances had shut down and stopped explaining things because they dismissed him as not understanding. So she felt this need to be ever present, right? Talk about leading to distrust. And this is not about all situations. We know, right? We are in this field. We know people have the best of intentions. That's why they've chosen this field. They are compassionate. They are empathetic. But there are these nuances that are difficult to navigate unless you get to a place of cultural humility. And then finally, what is the patient's own role in problem solving and in the process of decision making? You can't all of a sudden wake up one day and make a decision when traditionally you've depended on other people to make decisions for you your entire life, right? And it's so important for us to understand the climate, right, by asking these questions in order to achieve cultural humility. All right, if we go to the next slide. So death as a taboo subject. In some cultures, talking openly about death and dying is not acceptable. It's considered disrespectful, bad luck, or causes a loss of hope. For example, some Filipinos may request a family member not be told he or she is dying because of the concern for that person's loss of hope and belief that only God can decide a person's fate. For some Muslims, talking about death is taboo, and a religious leader may need to facilitate the conversation to include the male family leader and the healthcare provider about end-of-life care. Many cultures actively protect dying family members from knowing their prognosis. Here is the reality. As medical professionals, we have a responsibility to educate. We have a responsibility for the patient to know what is happening, but it doesn't mean that we need to exclude the people who are most important in his or her life. And that is a tricky territory to navigate, but very important to remember. The way death is viewed is very different in each culture. All right, next slide, please. Who makes decisions? Is there collective decision making? It's the norm in many cultures, but it often clashes with this American value of autonomy and an individual's right to make one's own decision. And the reason why I have a child pictured here is because in many instances, adults are like children in terms of their level of maturity in making these decisions. Be curious, be aware, be respectful, and be empathetic, and then you will understand how these decisions are made in that family unit. We all have a role to play in terms of rebuilding trust with the healthcare system, because we know that where there's distrust, there's avoidance of care, which only makes things worse. So we all have that responsibility. All right, next slide, please. Remember as well, the perception of the physician's status and healthcare experience really differs based on your country of origin. I once had a caregiver who said to me, I don't understand. I give instructions relative to the plan of care. I'm asking for compliance relative to the medication that's been prescribed, and the family nor the patient will make eye contact with me. Right? There is no response. In many Asian families, it would be disrespectful to make full eye contact, right? It would be disrespectful to ask questions of the medical professional. Patients from many countries may come from places where the physician makes all the healthcare decisions, and patients are really unaccustomed to be asked to choose among treatment options, which is why you ask yourself, as a healthcare provider, what am I missing based on what belief? And am I ready for the knowledge, right? Which means that I am open to new information and I'm not going to make assumptions based on my own lens, based on the way I reacted when I saw those images on the slide earlier. The patient and the family may have the expectation that it's a physician's role to actually decide on end-of-life care. It's really important for us to recognize what they view the role of the physician or medical professional to be. Next slide, please. Now, remember that response to pain also differs. Culture can affect a person's response to pain, both in the meaning and expression of pain. Some people, it's strong to be stoic, right? In some instances, pain may be seen as something positive, that it is a sign that the body is fighting towards recovery, or as a test of one's faith through suffering, or even as a punishment. I've been in households where patients toward end of life refuse pain medication because they have such strong addiction that's been a part of their family. So genetically, they believe that they are exposed and just absolutely refuse it. But I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't curious, if I wasn't aware, if I wasn't respectful and then empathetic. For some individuals, asking for pain medication is considered a sign of weakness, and for others, it actually masks what's going on. So what questions are we asking to understand the range of response to pain? And more importantly, what assumptions are we making based on their response to pain? Are we considering their background, their experiences, their opinions, all the things that we saw under strengths, under behaviors and attitudes on the earlier slide? All right, next slide, please. So remember, symptoms experienced, right, that include pain, nausea, vomiting, breathing difficulties, skin wounds, bowel and bladder problems, anxiety and depression, sleep disturbances. To address these symptoms, in some instances, patients may seek the care of spiritual healers and the use of alternative practices, such as coining, cupping, right, palm reading. Sometimes they're focused on astrological computations for life guidance. My sister-in-law is Native American. She focuses on a lot of those aspects, right? Other Asian and Southeast Asian cultures, such as Cambodian and Vietnamese cultures, there is a belief in the importance of harmony in and between the body, mind, and soul. And this can result in wild illness when they're out of balance, right? So how they express these symptoms, how they want to manage through these symptoms can only be discovered through what? And I'm going to say this over and over again: curiosity, respect, awareness, right? And then ultimately empathy. Next slide, please. So remember the role of religion and faith. I know that there was a long discussion around the role of religion and faith with our first speaker. And this is so important because for many ethnically diverse cultures, the approach to health and illness is through the interconnection of mind, body, spirit with the nature of the environment. What is the role that faith and spirituality plays in the decision-making for patients and their families? Some spiritual healers strongly believe in reconnecting with their culture, their land, and their genealogy to restore a sense of identity. But remember what I said at the very beginning, you are never going to be an expert in all of these nuances. You can't be, which is why your only goal as you strive toward cultural humility is to be curious. Then educate yourself through awareness, apply the information respectfully, and then to be empathetic. Say, I am here to give you the best care possible. You are not going to be an expert in all these nuances, nor should you. Because if you thought you were, guess what would happen? You would walk into that household, you would speak to that patient and their family, and you would say, oh, you are from this background, right? You have this ethnicity, you're of this race, right? You're a Christian, these are your expectations. But the last thing that you want to do is assume you know. The best way to be culturally humble is to assume you don't know. is to assume that you have to do the work. That is what's most important. All right, why don't we go to the next slide? So remember, the use of traditional healing is very prevalent in many households, and it's generally acceptable by ethnically diverse patients in the care of terminal illness. And it depends on the level of acceptance based on a number of different factors. And so you ask yourself the question, how assimilated is the individual to American culture? When did this family move? Right? Are we speaking about somebody who is a first-generation American? And it's really important. Let me tell you, the worst question that you can ask anyone, and I hope if you take nothing away from the conversation today, you remember this, is to meet someone and make an assumption and say to them, where are you from? Just because someone looks different to you, we should not make an assumption around them being non-Americans. Very important that we never ask that question as a medical professional. Alternative practices may be used simultaneously with Western medicine because of the perceived, and I'm going to say that again, it's a mind game, the perceived effectiveness of the treatment experienced by the patient. Having a lens that's optimistic of the patient, as you know, is extraordinarily important. And so the last thing we want to say as culturally humble medical professionals is we know that doesn't work, right? If you want to do it alongside traditional Western medicine and we don't think that it's going to interfere, why not if it makes them feel better? All right, next slide, please. Here's another situation I want us to work through using the CARE model. The patient's family members see that I have a pride sticker on my car, and they are devout Christians and refuse to allow me into the household to care for the patient. So let us apply the CARE framework, curiosity, right? So here's a caregiver or medical professional. Can you share your concerns with the pride sticker? The response: by being around my son, the son is a patient, you may make him gay. Awareness: has this happened in the past to you or anyone you know? Response: no, it has not, but I'm still worried that this is possible. Question: are you comfortable if I can commit to not discussing my sexual orientation with the patient? If you become uncomfortable at any time, I will no longer be his nurse. Response: okay, that's fine with me, because what you're saying is my feelings are my feelings. And so I'm going to commit to not discussing my sexual orientation with the patient because, again, we want the same things. It doesn't mean that we have shared beliefs. You may have very different beliefs and values to your patients and your patients' families, but we are in the business of providing care in a culturally competent manner. Here's my empathetic statement. I understand that you have your own beliefs and respect that fully. My job is not to change the way you think, but to acknowledge your feelings and ensure that I'm able to perform my role in helping you and your family. All right, let's go through to the next slide. So again, curiosity, awareness, respect, and empathy. And I like the fact that you're going to see this peppered throughout the presentation today. So there is no way for you to ever forget this framework. And then we have one final example and situation I'm going to apply the CARE framework to if you go to the next slide. So here is a situation. It's now election season. And the family is very prolific about the candidate they're supporting and would like your point of view. Curiosity: I really appreciate you wanting to know my perspective. It makes me feel like a true member of the family, but it is a policy of my employer and quite frankly, my personal policy not to share my political views. Response: we spend so much time with you. It's important to know that there is alignment in our views. Question: can you share how political alignment impacts the care that I'm able to provide, as I may be missing the connection? Genuinely, you're genuinely saying to them, help me understand why this is important to my providing care. Response: the patient is in this situation because of gunshot wounds. And so I'm anti-gun violence, for example, and any political party that supports it, right? So they're taking a position on it. And here is the question, right, from the caregiver. I truly understand your position on this, but the organization requires strict adherence to their policies, and I'm sure you can understand why this may be the best approach in many situations. Okay, I certainly understand it if it's company policy. Stand your ground around company policy and what it's okay to share and not share. Empathy statement: I care about you and your family, and I'm here to provide you with the best care possible. And my perspectives will never interfere with the care provided. All right, so that's our last situation. If you would take the slide down, I want to open up to any questions that you may have. And I want you to leave with these questions that you are going to ask yourself as culturally humble medical professionals. What am I assuming? Where am I filling in the gaps due to a lack of information? How are my assumptions causing me to provide care in a different manner? If I think about how I would protect my loved ones in need of care, would that help me to understand this person's point of view and be more empathetic?
Thank you, Ms. Emmons. So we just wanted to see your face. I hope you don't mind that.
Absolutely.
No, I absolutely love your emphasis on cultural humility and the care framework. And it struck me walking in here today. I saw that this week is Patient Experience Week. And I know there's a lot of designations of weeks throughout the year, but we should be paying attention to patient experience every day. And it is about being humble enough to take the time to listen to people. And mainstream medicine does not have a history of being very good at that. In fact, that's one of the major reasons the whole specialty of palliative care came about in the mid-90s. So thank you for really hammering home that message. And I'll take any questions for Ms. Emmons. Sarah.
Thank you for in a situation about where a family member felt that speaking any negative prognosis or any negative health information would cause it to happen and would cause the patient to get sicker or die. And while we were listening and trying to be respectful, it was also very difficult between that balance to the need to educate and provide information so they could make decisions. Do you have any advice for how to navigate that difficult situation?
So the question was in a situation where a family was very reluctant to share bad prognosis and information about a pending death with the patient themselves, and how do we get beyond that and deal with that kind of a situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's all about two things, right? Really building trust with the patient and the patient's family. And as you know, anybody who is on this call or in that room knows that trust doesn't start when you're having the first difficult conversation. It really starts well before that. So really paying attention to what are the dynamics, right, in this household. Who do you recognize to be the person who's asking all the questions, who's explaining everything to the patient, and really respecting that person and their role, but letting them know that we too have a responsibility, right? So we're happy to include anybody that they want to include in having the conversation, but as medical professionals, we have ethics. And so we have to have that conversation, but we are happy to include anybody that it would make them comfortable included. It could be a spouse, it could be their pastor, it could be their spiritual healer, it doesn't matter, but being inclusive is key and building that relationship of trust. And I love the statement, we want the same things. I think that if we begin and we end with that, it really underscores and reminds everyone that we are aligned, which is how you build trust.
That is so true. We want the same things. Yeah.
You ask her, is it ever okay to ask the patient after the patient say, I do not want to know?
So the question is it ever okay to ask the patient themselves and let the patient redirect the information?
Yeah, so I think that different organizations have different policies. The organization that I work for, we have a focus on home health and hospice. And our policy is that we have to include the patient in the conversation because it's really important to us as medical professionals that we have the full awareness, right? We've shared the information, but we're happy to bring on board anybody who is required to help to soften, right, that conversation and deliver it appropriately.
You know, it has been my experience that there are rare times when the patient clearly directs the conversation and the information to a designated family member.
Yeah.
And that really fulfills their autonomy, their responsibility for their own autonomy. And we can accept that, I think, at some level.
Yeah, yeah. And I think some of these things boil down to the policy, right, that we operate by.
Related to your commentary about the different cultures and how they look at information about dying, there is a movie called Farewell. I don't know if you're aware of it, with the famous actress Awkwafina, and she is a Chinese daughter living in the U.S. and she goes back to China to find that her grandmother, who everybody thinks is dying, nobody's telling her, and it turns out in the end she's not really dying, which was kind of funny, but it was just a example of that kind of cultural phenomena that we have to be aware of and work with.
Yeah.
Jay.
But you earlier, best thing for us to take away, one of the many benefits to have something that they from, but the thing that we should take away from that patient learning from would be another approach.
So the question is, and I actually wondered about this too, because, you know, what is the harm of asking a person where they're from? It may kind of single them out as being from somewhere other.
Yes.
And what would be another approach to that, Ms. Emmons?
Yeah, I think by observing. So in other words, there are people who will observe the fact that I have an accent. Maybe I'll speak about the fact that I moved here as a first-generation immigrant, but I share that information very openly. Whereas there are some people who may be first generation or even second generation in this country, and I feel like I was born in the US. Stop asking me where I'm from, because the golden rule is assume you know nothing. That's what being culturally humble is. It means that we're always starting over because there's new information. And I'll give you an example. I'm a first generation immigrant moving from Jamaica. However, I'm very tied to my family who's all in Jamaica. You could have someone who's a first generation Jamaican and they never go back to Jamaica, so they don't share in a lot of the same cultural experiences, right? And so making assumptions just because you know someone who's Jamaican would be dangerous. And that's a way to really build distrust. That becomes a challenge, but they will share it with you. For me, it's such a big part of my identity. I'll always share it. So just allow it to come forward.
Keegan, are there any questions on the chat? Anything else? You know, it strikes me we really got quite a spread of perspectives today, from the spiritual perspective to dealing with an aging population and all the social determinants of health that go into health for aging individuals, to this cultural humility thing, which is so important to good medical care. It really, which is kind of what palliative care is about. How do we provide optimal medical care? There's a lot more to it than simply treating disease and treating the numbers and applying the medications, right? So thank you all for attending. Thank you to all our presenters. And we'll wind it up. Yeah. So for those of you online and here in person, the way you're going to be able to get CMEs or CEs is that we will send you an email link. Oh, I'm sorry, it's on the link at the very bottom. You simply click on that and you will get a post-conference test. And if you achieve 80% on that, you'll get a format or a attestation for 3 hours or however many hours you participated of CEs. And you will have to also fill out a survey. Are we sending that survey separately, Keegan? It's all there. Okay. All right, so click on this link to claim your CEs and it's free. So no reason not to do it. Thank you all again. We'll see you next year or in the fall at the awards dinner.